He survived years behind bars and walked out determined to rebuild everything he lost. But just when life finally gave him a second chance, a simple traffic stop delivered a twist no one saw coming. What happened on that roadside would leave his entire community stunned, and it exposed something much darker beneath the surface. Before everything spiraled, he lived a life that most people around him assumed was ordinary. He wasn't perfect, but he wasn't the monster some later tried to paint him as either. Growing up, he dealt with the kind of pressure that pushes people in directions they never planned to go. One wrong decision led to another, and before he knew it, he was facing a sentence that would take years away from him. Prison forced him to confront everything he'd been avoiding. He spent those years fighting to stay focused, trying to keep his mind intact in a place designed to break people down. But even in the darkest moments, he held on to one thing: if he ever made it out, he'd never come back. That promise kept him going when nothing else did. By the time he finally walked out, he wasn't the same person who went in. He had plans, he had a direction, and he was determined to prove that he deserved another shot. And for a moment, it looked like he might actually get it, but that wasn't the whole story. The first days back in the real world felt unreal to him. Simple things, breathing outside air, hearing people laugh, choosing his own meals, almost felt like luxuries. He wanted to do everything right. He talked about getting steady work, reconnecting with family, and proving that he wasn't the same person who walked into that cell years ago. But freedom isn't as simple as stepping outside a gate. The world had changed while he was gone, and not everyone believed he had changed with it. Some people kept their distance. Others watched him like they were waiting for him to mess up again. He tried to ignore it, reminding himself that every fresh start takes time. Still, he pushed forward. He stayed out of trouble, stayed focused, and stayed hopeful. For the first time in years, he could see a future that wasn't defined by prison walls. But just when life started to feel normal again, one drive home was about to shatter that progress in seconds. It was supposed to be a quiet drive, nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. He wasn't speeding, wasn't swerving, wasn't doing anything that would draw attention. But as he turned onto a long stretch of road, those blue lights lit up behind him. For a second, he didn't even panic. After all, people get pulled over every day. Most stops end with a warning, maybe a ticket, and life moves on. But something about this one felt different. The officer approached slower than normal, like he was expecting trouble before a single word was exchanged. And the moment their eyes met, he felt that familiar pressure in his chest, the same feeling he used to get in prison when anything could go wrong without warning. He tried to stay calm, reminding himself that he wasn't breaking any laws. He had nothing to hide. Still, something in the air didn't sit right. He didn't know it yet, but this stop was about to escalate in a way no one could have predicted, and it would change everything. The moment the officer asked him to step out of the car, he knew this wasn't a normal stop anymore. The tone shifted, sharp, commanding, almost like the officer was dealing with someone dangerous. He'd heard that tone before, back in a place where every wrong move could get you hurt, and it sent his nerves straight into overdrive. He tried to follow every instruction exactly, keeping his hands visible, speaking calmly, doing everything in his power not to give anyone a reason to react. But the officer's questions kept getting more intense, more suspicious, like he'd already made up his mind about who he was dealing with. It didn't matter that he was keeping his cool. It didn't matter that he had no weapons, no illegal SHT, nothing to hide. Then things escalated fast. The officer claimed he smelled something, the classic line that turns a simple stop into a full-blown search. He knew what that meant. Once they decide something's there, they'll find a way to justify it. And as more officers arrived, he realized he was losing control of the situation. His freedom, the one thing he fought so hard to protect, was slipping through his fingers again. What happened over the next few minutes would stun everyone who heard about it, and it marked the beginning of the biggest setback he'd faced since walking out of prison. By the time the officers finished their search, the situation had already spiraled far past anything he could control. They didn't find anything dangerous, nothing illegal, nothing that justified turning a simple stop into a full interrogation. But the damage was already done. The moment they saw his record, everything changed. Suddenly, he wasn't a man trying to rebuild his life. He was a former inmate, treated like he must be hiding something simply because of his past. One of the officers claimed he'd been acting suspicious, a vague accusation that carries weight even when it's baseless. That was all they needed to justify detaining him. To them, his history was enough. No evidence, no wrongdoing, just a label he couldn't escape. Hours later, when they finally released him, he walked out with the same feeling he had on the day he was first arrested, like the world was stacked against him, no matter how hard he tried to do things right. The job he was excited about starting? Gone. The progress he'd made? Undone in a single afternoon. And the fear he thought he'd left behind in prison had come right back with him. But the worst part wasn't the detention. It was the realization that this incident was about to follow him everywhere, long after the lights stopped flashing. As he tried to pick up the pieces, he realized this wasn't just about one bad encounter. It exposed a reality he'd hoped wasn't true. Once you've been inside, you're never really treated like you're free. People look at you differently. Officers approach you differently. And even when you're doing everything right, one moment of suspicion can drag your past right back into your present. Friends told him to stay strong, to keep pushing forward, but the truth hit harder than any advice. If a harmless drive could unravel his entire fresh start, what chance did he really have? How many other people walked out of prison ready to change, only to get pulled right back down by a system that refuses to see them as anything but their worst mistake? His story became a warning, one that echoed far beyond his neighborhood. It showed how fragile freedom can be, how quickly trust can disappear, and how easily someone trying to do better can be pulled into situations they never asked for. But even after everything he lost that day, his story didn't end there. He walked out of prison believing the hardest part of his life was finally behind him. But that traffic stop proved something he never wanted to accept: freedom isn't guaranteed just because a sentence ends. One moment of suspicion, one assumption, one officer who saw his past instead of his progress, and everything he worked for was shaken all over again. His story isn't just about a single roadside encounter. It's about how people trying to rebuild their lives are still forced to fight battles they thought were over. And it leaves one question hanging long after the lights fade. If someone can survive prison but still lose everything during a routine stop, what does starting over really mean?